Well, Krystal, welcome to the journey. I know we've known each other for a while, but I'm Kevin Polky, and for the people that are watching and listening to us, and this is the journey, and the journey is just that. It's about listening to individuals tell their stories about transformation and where they've been along in their life. So just want to welcome you here. I know we've known each other for a while. I think it goes all the way back to like 2011. Yeah, around that time period.
That this morning. Mm-hmm.
And that was when I first opened up the Wellness Center, and I think we met through a mutual friend. And you were just starting off, at least or beginning the process of nutritional coaching and in that whole aspect of that. And so it was very. I really enjoyed you being there, and enjoyed being able to refer people to you regarding that piece. But before we jump into all that, and I know you do a lot of different things, and you're married and you have two young boys. What does Krystal do for fun? If you're going to have fun and it's not working and it's not food prepping and all that stuff, what do you do for fun?
Yeah, so fun it means something different in different times.
Okay.
Sometimes fun is, having a great conversation that's raw and transparent and real. And then sometimes fun is just being out by myself, walking in nature, journaling, or and then sometimes fun is going to Starbucks and getting a tea and going to a Goodwill and seeing what treasures I can find.
Sure.
So I like to think of myself sometimes as an extroverted introvert.
Okay. Well, I can definitely relate to that, because there's a time period where I like being around people, but there's definitely an element where I need solitude, and I need that alone time and time to reflect, and time just to be able to either reflect on my own thoughts, or maybe just let my thoughts go in itself. So let's, if you could, just for for the people that are listening, tell us a little bit about how you got into being a nutritional coach, doing food therapy. Tell us a little bit about how that all came about.
Yeah, so just to kind of keep that part short, weight and body image was something that I've struggled with since I was a very young girl. Trying to figure out how to eat right, so that I could put my body into a place of submission where I would lose weight and be thin and feel beautiful and find confidence and all of these things that I believed thinness and beauty was supposed to give you. So part of my story is that my first diet was in 3rd grade, and I started to learn about food, but I didn't learn about nutrition. I learned about diet education, what foods were good and what foods were bad, and if you want to lose weight, you need to eat these foods, and if you don't want to lose weight, then you eat these foods, and making them good, making them bad, and if you ate the good food, you were a good girl. If you ate the bad food, you were a bad girl, and started down this very dysfunctional relationship with food. And all the while I thought that the answers were within the nutrition aspect, the macronutrients, the workout, the formula, when really it wasn't ever about what I was eating, it was about why I was eating. Food was my best friend. Food was my coping. Food was my secret thing that I did to fill up and to be loved. Growing up in a very abusive home, verbally and physically, it became part of just my comfort. And so moving forward, I had quite a journey within the adolescence and the teenage years of my life, and all the while I felt like I just needed to learn more about food in my struggle and in my pain with my body. And so I went to school for nutrition. I started to practice as a nutritionist, and meanwhile I was still struggling with good girl or bad girl, being perfect with food or being really, really bad. Either I was really good or really bad, and so I would restrict myself as hard as possible.
And that's being good.
And that was being good.
Okay.
Good girl. I'm restricting. I'm working out. I'm doing what I know to do as a nutritionist. Macronutrients, counting calories, counting steps, all of these things, until I just couldn't take it anymore. Trying to look at food as fuel was not what was bringing me to a place where I felt free from my obsession and the control food had over me.
Okay. Real quick, but why do you think, why food? I mean, there's a lot of things, right? Maybe not in third grade necessarily, but there's a lot of things that you could have chosen. But why do you think food was the thing that became that comfort, that best friend? Why food over something else? Why do you think that was?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. Number one, growing up in a home where your value was put on your beauty, your size, your femininity. So it almost made the very thing that you liked being a bad thing very attractive.
Okay.
And then number two, we were very poor. Okay. We ate a lot of the second-day-old bread store stuff, and an Italian family with lots of bread and oils and savory things. Okay. And so food was very cheap. Okay. Food was something that I was rewarded with when I did good, by a mom who saw me in my pain. And so it became just something that, for me, obviously knowing this as a therapist, lighting up the dopamine receptors of the brain and almost getting that sedative or that distraction away from the environment you're in, where you feel so powerless and so victimized, that I found that if I ate a certain way or certain things, I would in the moment feel loved, I would feel worth it, but then it would follow up with feeling shame and feeling guilt and, oh my gosh, what have I done? Where amazingly, I wasn't thinking about my home environment anymore. I wasn't thinking about the things people said to me. Now I was thinking about how angry I was at myself and how lack of discipline and how worthless I was. Okay.
Because I remember, so food was my thing as well, and it probably started in the original seeds probably also started in grade school. And I remember watching my uncles go into whatever, Burger King or whatever it was, and they would order 2 Whoppers and fries and a huge Coke, and because I was only in grade school, I could only have one, and one fry. And so there's this idea that a real man, can eat a certain amount of food. And I looked up to these guys. They were obviously, 15, 20 years older than me. But I looked up to them, and I, probably as much as I could at that time aspire to want to be like them. That, I think, was the beginning of that piece. And there was also the time period I remember that I was helping my aunt out and ironing, and they go, how do you do that? And then my uncle looked over at me and said, why are you doing women's work? Why are you doing girls' work? And I was like, there was that shame that you talked about, that message. And so even though in that case it had nothing to do with food, but there was this definite this starting to place with masculinity, and then it really took a whole different turn when I was in middle school, when started working out, and because I think I was about 11 going into 7th grade, and started working out, and when I went for wrestling, that was the first time that you dieted to get to a lower weight class.
Right.
And I also was the first time that I saw someone in person that had a six-pack. And I no longer wanted to be like my uncles who might have been overweight. Now I wanted to look like that.
Yeah.
And then, that along with recognizing the rewards that came from working out, and the acknowledgement, not only athletically but then socially.
Yeah.
That began a whole track that obviously got huge during when I was bodybuilding and stuff. So how would you say now, because when I was asking about the food, because I know for me food was the socially acceptable one, where in our home alcohol wasn't necessarily or the abuse of alcohol wasn't socially acceptable. Drugs weren't even acknowledged. I mean, that was completely something that wasn't socially acceptable. But alcohol or food, was socially acceptable, and so you would get that feeling, that dopamine rush. You'd get that comfort from it, let alone the socialization of it. How would you say now, fast forwarding, right? So that's a part of it, and similar to myself, you've gone through vast, changes in diet, but like any time when there's a diet, there's also going to be a time when you're not dieting, and I remember going through those cycles of when you get off the diet, then you just kind of lose your mind. Yeah. At least I did. I lost my mind because the fear of having to deprive again would cause me to then binge even more. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that restrict and binge cycle is what ruled me for so long, and hundreds of pounds at a time. So how long was the restriction going to last this time? Maybe it was a day. Maybe that day I woke up and I'm like, I'm not going to eat much today, and then by the end of the night I couldn't take it anymore and I would eat for 4 hours straight. Or maybe the restriction would last a whole week and I would eat my boiled chicken and my steamed broccoli until I just couldn't take it anymore. Yeah. And so I never really found true, what I felt at the time, control over food until my parents introduced me to a drug. I shouldn't say my parents, the doctors introduced me to a fix, which at the time on the market was Fen-Phen.
Sure.
Fen-Phen was an amazing, magical thing because all of a sudden I wasn't obsessed about food. All of a sudden I had this amazing energy that made me feel like I could conquer anything. Sure. Yeah. And so with that, I was like, this is what I needed. I just need to, not think about food. But what I didn't know is this was going to start me on a whole trajectory, a path of being addicted to stimulants that were going to give me this false confidence and this false control and this false self-control over the power food had over me.
And I know for me that the beginning of that, the food was one thing, and it ends up being more than just fuel, because it was really ended up being more about appearance, more about image, and then
absolutely,
and that idea of image is so subjective, anyways, because it just depends on who the eye of the beholder is, right? It has nothing, to do with me. I mean, I remember when I was bodybuilding, and my wife Diane knew me at that time. She had actually gone to a couple shows because of friends of mine. She had ended up being there. But years later, when we were talking, she goes, you look better now than you ever did when you were competing, and that was such a foreign thing for me to understand, because I was thinking that this was the ideal when I was competing, and in reality, it was an activity, it was a time period, and then later on, some of the complications that came with that, injuries and different things like that, because of neglect or imbalances that happened, and I'm still dealing with some of those today. But how now? Obviously, you've come a long ways. I know you a few years ago you were sick, and that was a major turn. Yeah. But tell us a little bit about not just what you've had to do nutritionally and change things nutritionally, but what things have you had to do then also from inside, from a spiritual standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, because it isn't education.
Right.
It's not more intellect, because as we both know, we can know a ton of information, but at 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm going downstairs to grab something in the darkness of the night, and that has nothing to do with intellect.
Right, absolutely.
And my willpower is less at 2 a.m. Than it is at 2 p.m.
Right.
And so what for you has been, if there was a shift, or if there was, and maybe that came from hitting some kind of bottom that may have happened, but if there has been a spiritual or emotional shift toward looking at it, what has that been? If you look back on where you were at 10 years ago.
Yeah, I would say that it all comes down to 2 words.
Okay.
And that would be control and surrender.
Okay.
Expectation is premeditated resentment.
Okay.
And when we expect our lives to turn out in a certain way, and we work and we work and we push that this is how life is supposed to work out, that sets us up to resent our lives. If I push and I push my body to get this, because I'm expecting it to get this result and it doesn't, I'm resentful against my body. I'm resentful against the life that I have, that it shouldn't have worked out this way because it wasn't my expectation. And I think where the turn, because the truth is, transformation is progression, right?
Yeah.
We think there's like this fictitious place of arrival.
Right.
Like, once I get here, then I will be good.
Right.
Or then I will be, whatever, right? The angels will sing. But it's progressive. And so what I knew 10 years ago, I thought that was my transformation, right? And only to learn in my wisdom now that transformation is perpetual, that it just keeps going and evolving, and it's, choosing growth outside of comfort. It's choosing awareness outside of numbing, right? So surrender in the way that this life is I am pushing and pushing and working, and things aren't working out the way that I'm struggling to get them to work out. And if I believe that that I'm in control, at the end of the day, I'm to blame for everything. But where the main part came in is that God is God and I am not.
Okay.
And so right now in this place, I have a decision to make. Do I keep on grinding and keep on doing what I feel like is the expectation of my life, or take a step back and I surrender and I let life kind of unfold? Life, meaning my body, my success level, my status, my position, all of these different things that were in the sidelines, almost false idols to me.
So it sounds like, because I know from what you told me, just years ago, growing up, you came from a pretty conservative household, right? And church was kind of a lot of rules and some regiment with that. How has so it's similar to what you were just talking about with building up this idea of these expectations to be a certain way, and then all will be good,
right?
And then it becomes an emptiness or resentment. How has, for you, your concept of God, how has that changed?
Yeah. So growing up in a religious household, it was actually Mormon and Catholic.
Okay.
Very dysfunctional. And then my mom was also New Age, depending on the day. So she'd read tarot cards here or there, then we'd go to church over here and following these rules. So really looking back, my mom was on a journey of her own and kind of tugged us around with that. So very confused about, who is God.
Okay.
All I knew is what I felt when I was in certain places. The confines of church, of who we as humans like to make God within the church, didn't work for me. It made it too formalized, that this plus this plus this equals this. And that didn't work with the way I'm wired. So a big part of my discovery in faith was that God never said anywhere that he has to fit in that box. That I can surrender and follow Jesus without having to do this plus this plus this. That can look different for me.
Okay.
So where do I connect with God? I connect with God in nature. I connect with God in worship and song. And so I digress here because that could be a whole nother conversation within itself. But it's relationship. It's relationship. And I know so many religious people that miss the relationship aspect. And that is the knowing, the intimacy. What's the word intimacy? It means into me you see. God sees into me, and I see into him. And there's an amazing chemistry and an intimacy that comes with the relationship of God in my life.
And the reason why I ask that is because it sounds almost like there's this parallel between how you became more and more informed and educated about food, and how you can utilize food, how you can utilize exercise, right? And so it became almost like a religion.
Absolutely.
Right? And then there was, especially in certain conservative churches, can have this formula. If you do A, B, and C, this is the outcome, right? And you act a certain way, but very similar to how it can be with restricting, as you were talking about with food. Then there's this stuff that happens behind closed doors. There's stuff that happens when no one's watching that may not necessarily be the same look that you have in your face when you're around people, right? Or at church or wherever it may be. So I know for me that was a big part of one of the things that I learned early on that I could do well was discipline. Now, there's upsides and downsides of that. I would rather have discipline than not. But then, how do you do the opposite? How do you ever let go? How do you ever relax? And so that was something that I had to learn and continue to learn, and probably still don't do as well as that as I will in the future as I continue to work on that piece of it. But
so good.
When you were talking about that idea of seeing food differently, seeing yourself differently, because food is just a thing, right? I mean, it's just no different than alcohol or drugs or gambling or sex or whatever it may be to get that feeling. But it was more about appearance. It was more about that beauty. And then what was that about? And I think sometimes we do the same thing, or can do the same thing with religion, is that I'm looking to get something from that. Am I trying to get God's approval, or I'm trying to get people's approval? Am I trying to get God and people's approval? But at some point, I know for me, that was I crossed that path, and I know that wasn't how it originally started for me. I remember experiencing God long before I ever knew any other, what the rules were, because it just felt right, and it was out in nature, and the stories made sense, and it was like, I didn't question it. It was only later that the exclusion of other people, the exclusion of other activities that started complicating things and not really making sense. So, and I know that we all have certain things that are tripping points, right? That bring up fear for us. For one person, it may be appearance, right? It may be identity that's wrapped up into my appearance. Someone else, it may be financial security, or it may be again similar to status or that. And at some point, we hit this crossroads. That's where we talk about it brings us to our bottom, right? And I know, I mean, I don't know a ton about what happened when you got sick, the most recent time when you got sick. But what would you say that from that element, from an emotional, spiritual standpoint, not just an educational standpoint, you know, but more from an emotional, spiritual standpoint, or maybe you can tell us just a little bit about what happened, and then what did you pull out of that from an emotional, spiritual standpoint?
Yeah. So all of these years, right? We know that the outcome of consistency over time is what wins. If I'm doing this thing and living this way consistently over time, that's going to be kind of the outcome.
Right.
So consistency over time, you know, very unhealthy relationship with food, very unhealthy relationship with identity, vanity, unhealthy relationship with comparison and being of good enough, will end up leading you to a place. And that place, a lot of times people refer to as a midlife crisis or rock bottom. And your rock bottom, before this happened, I felt like I had already had a rock bottom.
Sure.
Isn't that funny? But it's different for everyone, and it's different for every story, the way it plays out. But where it brought me was that this idea within myself that I am what I appear to be. We can say vanity. I am liked or not liked based on my appearance, is no longer working for me.
Right.
My body is failing. It basically, and it had been progressive. You know, type 2 diabetes when I was 18, went away for a while, came back. Autoimmune diseases, lupus and Hashimoto's, and a lot of hormonal things because of the up and down of everything.
Restriction.
Yeah. Plus the stimulants and the all of the things that we do in that world to our bodies to get them to submit. And all of that had kind of come to a tipping point where it had to come down to, and I shared this recently, that health always was an image. And I may have looked the image, but I wasn't healthy. And so I was fake. I felt like such a hypocrite that I'm looking the part. And what kept me there was comparison. I took the stick of comparison all of the time as a nutritionist, and I would break it over my leg, and I would either stab other people with it or stab myself with it. That, if I don't look the part, then nobody's gonna listen to what I have to say or think what I have to say as a nutritionist is valid. And so all of that had to be put aside because now I was sick. I was gaining weight at a rapid rate. I wasn't even able to stay awake for more than 8 hours at a time, let alone being exhausted. So it came down to me getting rid of everything that I had learned within myself and unlearn all of the diet culture, all of the false beliefs even about nutrition, all of the false beliefs about my identity, about who I was, about why I was good enough, and start all over. Literally start over. Okay.
And when you... So at that point, so it reminded me when I was one of my very first times of being in that into that dark night of the soul was, and I remember what was crashing for me was this idea that if I stopped this bodybuilding, who would I be?
Right.
Who would I be? And the fear was that this was my identity.
Yeah.
And I have no clue, so I have to keep going. And so this idea of and so that was my thing. My identity was wrapped. It wasn't an activity, but it was an identity. And so for you, which was false, right? It was maybe what I did and maybe how people knew me, but my labeling it as being my identity, that was on Kevin. and so similar. I'm hearing you say that being wrapped up, looking a certain way, and then making that your story, then it wasn't working.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't working because there wasn't integrity in it, because what you were portraying and what you were doing were not exactly the same thing. You were still yo-yoing. It just you just had another falseness of it.
Yeah.
So what's different now? Tell us a little bit about how are you on a day-to-day basis? Because if you're like me, just because I remember doing it. I recreated it again. My identity ended up being the counseling agency, right? And I got too wrapped up in that, and I couldn't separate myself. And there was these key words of that I now look back and go, whenever I say have to, should, supposed to, can't, those are trigger words for me. That Kevin, you might be getting too close here. This might be getting all confused again, and you're hanging on too tightly. Because what do you mean can't? Have to. Because I teach that there's always minimally three choices, right? But when I'm saying to myself there's only two choices, this or that, I know that I'm slipping. Yeah. And just because I know that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't happen, right? And so where are you at now with this? I mean, obviously you're doing different things as far as nutritionally, but again, that could fall into a pattern of just being another lifestyle change. But what's going on inside with Krystal so that she can stay within the lines for Krystal?
Yeah.
What things do you do to stay between the lines for you, besides just a different form of regimen?
Yeah. So remembering that, the quote, the pain of change has to be less than the pain of remaining the same. Right? So remaining the same was so painful for me. I may have appeared different, but I was still the same. Becoming a nutritionist just perpetuated the psychological and the identity that was tied to image. It really did. Right. I went into it to find freedom, and I ended up walking down a path where it just bound me up even tighter. So what do I do now? Surrender is a daily choice. A daily choice. And that's what transformation really is a practice, right? How do I perceive things? How do I perceive who I am? How do I step out and I do something and I focus on the good of each day instead of focus on the lack or focus on the negative? And so for me, it's each day, what's going on inside of me? What do I need? And I know that could probably sound very selfish, but today do I need rest? Do I need to push? What is it that I need so that I can remain true to myself and I can stand on this platform of true health? Because if not, our culture is we're so inundated with comparison everywhere. And so I don't scroll through Instagram and look at everybody's things. I keep myself protected of those things that I put out to people what I feel like is inside of me, but I don't receive everything that's out there. So boundaries are very different now. I had to set some, not rules, but boundaries. What are the boundaries that keep making me sick, either mentally, emotionally, or physically? And I need to stay within those boundaries because I'm worth it, because I'm made for more than being over here and struggling. So what are those things? So staying within those boundaries of health and each day surrendering to what God has for my life and for me without me being God over my life.
Sure. Something you just said that kind of just remind me of something that I do now of trying to ask myself if I'm going to do something, instead of just doing it, instead of just doing it because this is what I've always done, or this is the pattern of mine. Do I need to do it this way? What's the reason I think I need to do it this way? Is that coming from some other agenda? Is that coming from some other thing? Is that one of those have-tos? Or is it, well, no, I need to go down, I'm going down this path because that's I'm curious, what's that going to lead to?
What is my why?
Yeah. And so it's, and being able to just have the freedom. I remember a couple years ago, I went on a sabbatical, and it was sabbatical from counseling. I was still doing some work and stuff like that, but I remember that I went out and I didn't have any structure to my day. So that was the first time since I didn't know when, right?
What do I do?
Yeah, and so I would go and I would go to the office and I would meditate for 2-3 hours at a time, and I knew that I didn't want to just busy myself, but it was really about trying to reflect, trying to explore and be open from an emotional and spiritual standpoint. And then if there was something, then I would go and that I was curious about, I would go and explore what that was. And I was out at a local forest preserve, and I was just walking. And I noticed that, okay, I'm going to go this way. And I was just going off the path, just going wherever. And there was a trigger that happened. I remember one time when I was in grade school with my mom and my aunt, and we were out at some local park, and we got lost. And I remember at least thinking that they were scared. So I was scared because they were scared that we had gotten lost. Now, I don't know how much we could have got lost. It was a park that was in the middle of the city. But but as a little kid, there was that feeling, and I remember after that not ever going off the path when I'd go hiking, regardless of where it was at, regardless of if I was in Colorado or South Dakota or wherever I was at, I wouldn't go off the path. Well, this day, I found myself going off the path and saying it'll be okay. I was being triggered. Yeah. You're not on the path. There may be something bad could happen. And that other part of me was like, it'll be okay. And just explored. And I think for me, metaphorically, that experience, right, that was really how I try to reflect back on that. That's how I need to do more of my life that way, like it was with that hike, because I can follow rules. I can be disciplined. I can restrict or I can push. I know how to do that. That part's easy. The part of being able to follow that spirit or follow that path or follow that curiosity or follow that curiosity that there is no path, that's kind of what I was hearing you starting to say a little bit of how to be able to give yourself permission to do that, and it'll be okay. It'll be okay.
Yeah. And a big part of that was that, my security is not in my identity. My security is not, it's found through my insecurity. So what is my security? And going back to that foundation of what is my true security? Right. I used to always say, embrace the journey, embrace the journey. And for myself, I had to shift that to embrace the adventure. Embrace the adventure. Right. Because the journey had always had this idea within my mind that the journey is, I'm setting the journey. That's me. But if I'm embracing an adventure, I have no idea where I'm headed or what's going to happen. And I'm married to somebody who's very structured, analytical thinker, and even, for him, that, hey, reminding each other, hey, we're just on this thing.
Yeah.
We're just in this adventure.
Yeah.
Let's go off the path.
Yeah.
I love that. There's such a message in that.
Yeah. And, and I know that with food is one of those things that because it's part of what we have to do on a daily basis, and then and you're going to get triggered to wrap food into that part of appearance. And so there's always going to be triggers. I mean, I know for me, there's always going to be, based upon the time of the year or whatever it may be. And so I would love to have you come back on at some time in the future, just because you'll be farther down your adventure. And I'd love to hear where you're at. Krystal, if there was anything that you would want, as we get ready to wrap up today, if there was anything that you'd want to share with anybody about that you've learned so far, what would you want to share? Just one, like a parting thing that you'd want to share with the people that are listening.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a big question. One thing would probably be to give ourselves permission to be aware. And to be aware without judgment, without guilt, without shame, but just to be aware. Aware of what I'm feeling, aware of my desires, aware of my likes and my dislikes, aware of what is good to me. But give ourselves permission to do that. It's almost like sometimes we, even as adults, we need to hear permission. We need to hear somebody give us permission.
Sure. Yeah.
So if I can give any of your listeners something, it would be permission. A permission slip.
Yeah. That definitely resonates with me, because that's when I was thinking, when you were just saying that, I was thinking that I had to give myself permission that it was okay not to be on the path. That it was just, I had to give myself permission and be aware of, just to be curious and just explore. So, Krystal, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. I always enjoy the time we get to spend together and always learn something from you. So,
it goes so fast.
So thank you very much for being here. And thank you for joining us. And this will be wrapping up this episode of The Journey. And please join us next week as well. Thank you.
So good.